The winter air in the city was a sharp, biting thing. It didn't just chill the skin. It seemed to seep into the bones, a damp, persistent cold that the towering buildings funneled into rushing rivers along the sidewalks. People moved through it like armored ships, heads down, shoulders hunched, their focus locked on the warm destinations ahead: a cozy apartment, a bustling restaurant, the next important meeting. In the heart of this cold, in the vast, echoing atrium of the Grand Central Metro Station, there was a pocket of slightly warmer, stale air. It smelled of damp wool, fast food, and the faint, metallic tang of the trains rumbling deep below. And here, tucked between a shuttered newsstand and a pillar plastered with faded advertisements, was the piano. It was a public piano, placed years ago by some optimistic city arts program. Its dark veneer was chipped, showing pale wood beneath like scars. Several keys, the ones most often hit, had lost their shiny surface and were worn down to a dull, matte finish. It was slightly out of tune, but not badly enough to be fixed, just enough to give every note a faint, lonely whisper. And at this piano, every day from 4 until 7, was the man. No one knew his name. The regular commuters, the ones who caught the same train each evening, had simply folded him into the landscape. He was as much a part of the station as the flickering departure board or the guy who sold soft pretzels. He was the pianist. To look at him, you wouldn't think of music first. You'd think of weariness. He was probably in his late 40s, but life had added extra layers, making it hard to tell. His hair, more gray than brown, was a little too long and fell across his forehead. He always wore a suit, a proper, two-piece suit, but it was a ghost of what it once was. The fabric, once a deep navy, was now a faded blue-gray. The elbows were thin and shiny, on the verge of wearing through. The cuffs were frayed, the threads coming loose like tiny, unraveling secrets. He sat on the piano bench with a posture that spoke of a long defeat. His shoulders were rounded, not with age, but with the weight of invisible burdens. He never made eye contact. His gaze was usually fixed on some middle distance, just above the heads of the passing crowd, or softly on his own hands as they rested in his lap. His hands were the only clue. They were long-fingered and slender, with prominent knuckles. They were clean, but the nails were short and uneven, as if bitten or broken. They were hands that didn't match the rest of him. At exactly 4 o'clock, he would place his old, battered leather bag, the kind with buckles, not a zipper, on the floor beside the bench. He'd open the lid, and inside, instead of sheet music, there were a few personal items: a worn cloth, a bottle of water, and a single, folded photograph whose face was never visible. He'd take a deep breath, a small, private ritual, and then his hands would lift to the keys. The music he played was pleasant. It was background noise, simple, meandering melodies of pop songs from 20 years ago, the easy chorus everyone could hum, a show tune or two, played without any theatrical flair, sometimes a basic classical piece, something a child might learn in their 3rd year of lessons. His playing was technically fine, perfectly adequate, but it had no heart. It was empty. The notes were correct, but the feeling, the soul of the music, was absent. It was sound meant to be heard, but not listened to. The crowd flowed around him like water round a stone. Hundreds of faces, a blur of purpose and distraction. Phone screens glowed like tiny, personal campfires. Headphones created silent, private bubbles. Conversations were snippets caught in the air. And then I told him the figures were all wrong. Pick up milk and bread. You won't believe what she said. Sometimes, a person would pause. A mother with a tired child would stop for a moment, letting the simple melody be a brief distraction. The child would stare, wide-eyed, at the man's moving fingers, but then the mother would check the time, gently pull the child's hand, and they would melt back into the stream. The donations were the worst part. He had an old violin case, its black felt lining faded to green in places, open on the floor by the piano's legs. Every so often, the ritual would happen. A well-dressed person, usually in a hurry, would approach without breaking their stride. They wouldn't look at the man's face. Their eyes would flick from the case to their own wallet. They'd pull out a coin, $1, sometimes just a quarter, and with a quick, almost dismissive flick of the wrist, they'd toss it into the case. It would land with a dull asterisk clink asterisk, a sound utterly swallowed by the station's noise. The man would always give a small, silent nod, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. His eyes never followed the donor. He never smiled in thanks. It was a transaction completely stripped of human connection. The giver bought a moment's relief from their own guilt for passing by someone in need. The receiver accepted a tiny contribution to his survival. No words, no recognition. It was cold, hard, and simple. And then there were the others. The ones who didn't just ignore him, but who noticed him enough to be amused. A group of young guys in sharp, expensive jackets, their hair perfectly styled, might linger nearby, waiting for a friend. One of them would gesture with his coffee cup towards the pianist. "Check out the maestro," he'd say, a smirk in his voice, playing the hits of 2003. Another would chuckle. "That suit's seen better days. Like, maybe in a previous life." Their laughter was low and private, a shared joke at the expense of a man they believed was beneath their notice. They saw the frayed cuffs, the vacant stare, the simple music. They saw a broken man, a piece of street furniture that played tunes. They never wondered about the story. They never listened to the spaces asterisk between asterisk the notes, which were filled with a silence louder than any train. The man heard it all. The laughter, the clinking coins, the rush of footsteps. He absorbed it like the old piano absorbed the station's damp. It didn't seem to anger him. It didn't seem to sadden him. His face remained a placid, unreadable mask. Only his eyes, if you ever got close enough to look, held a deep, settled sorrow. It was a look of someone who had loved something truly, deeply loved it and had it taken away. Now, he was just going through the motions, waiting for the clock to strike 7. At 7, his hands would still. He would play the final note of whatever simple song he was on and let it fade into nothing. He would close the piano lid with a soft, definitive thud. He would carefully place the cloth over the keys. He would pick up the violin case, not even counting the day's meager take, and tuck it under his arm. He would sling his old leather bag over his shoulder, the weight of it pulling his frayed suit jacket tighter across his thin frame. Then he would stand, that familiar slump returning instantly to his shoulders. Without a glance left or right, he would walk towards the station's east exit, moving against the tide of new commuters coming in. He would push through the heavy doors and vanish into the cold, darkening city, just another shadow among many, leaving behind only the faint, lingering smell of old wood and dust, and the memory of music that no one really heard. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays in the station had a special kind of grimness. The weekend was a distant memory, Friday a far-off dream. The crowd seemed more tired, their footsteps heavier, their faces etched with the particular strain of weekly obligations. The air was thick with the smell of wet raincoats and Tuesday despair. The man at the piano was deep inside one of his simple, looping melodies. It was a TV theme song from years back, harmless and forgettable. His fingers moved on autopilot, his mind somewhere else entirely, perhaps in the quiet of the photograph inside his bag. The usual river of people parted around him. A woman dropped a granola bar wrapper near his feet without noticing. A teenager, glued to his phone, almost tripped over the piano bench. Life flowed on. Near the pillar by the pretzel stand, a group had gathered. They were young, dressed in the uniform of success, sharp, dark blazers, crisp shirts, expensive watches that caught the fluorescent light. They were from one of the big financial firms a few blocks over. It was clear they'd come from what they called a debrief, which was really just drinks after work. There was a loose energy about them, a loud confidence fueled by a couple of beers. Their leader was a tall man with a voice that carried. He had the easy smile of someone used to being listened to. He was telling a story about a client, his hands chopping the air for emphasis. His friends laughed on cue, their eyes bright with the thrill of being part of the in-crowd. It was this man who first noticed the pianist. His gaze, scanning the station for his next train's track number, landed on the hunched figure and the old piano. A slow, amused smile spread across his face. He nudged the guy next to him and nodded toward the bench. "Look at that," he said, his voice pitched to be heard by his group. "Still on the grind. You gotta respect the hustle." I guess his friends turned. They saw what they always saw, the frayed suit, the empty eyes, the simple music. "What's he even playing?" one asked, wrinkling his nose. "Sounds like elevator music for a sad elevator." The leader's eyes dropped to the open violin case on the floor. A few coins and a single crumpled dollar bill lay inside. An idea, unkind and spontaneous, lit up his face. It was the kind of idea that feels clever when you've had a drink and are surrounded by people who will laugh. "Let's make a request," he announced, his tone full of mock ceremony. "Let's support the arts." He fished his wallet from his inside pocket, a sleek leather thing. He pulled out a $5 bill. It was a gesture, a performance for his audience. To him, it wasn't charity. It was a transaction for a joke. He strode over, his friends following in a loose, grinning pack. They formed a half-circle around the piano, a wall of expensive wool and expectation. The pianist didn't look up. His fingers continued their tired journey across the worn keys. The tall man stopped right by the violin case. He didn't bend down. He held the $5 bill between his fingers and then, with a deliberate, almost theatrical flick, let it flutter down. It landed silently on the felt. "Hey, maestro," the man said, his voice loud and jovial, cutting through the pianist's melody. "How about something with a little life in it? Something to get the blood pumping, eh? Play us something lively." One of his friends snorted, covering his mouth. Another shook his head, a wide grin on his face. They were all watching, waiting for the sad man to fumble into some cheerful, outdated pop song. It was a break in their Tuesday monotony, a little real-life entertainment. For the first time in maybe years, the pianist's hand stopped mid-phrase. The cheap TV theme song died with a faint, discordant echo. The sudden silence in his immediate space was shocking. It was as if a constant, background hum had been switched off, slowly, very slowly. The pianist lifted his head. He turned it and looked at the tall man. He didn't look at the money in the case. He looked directly into the man's eyes. It was a look that made the tall man's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. These weren't the vacant, defeated eyes he'd expected. They were deep-set, and old, weathered brown, and in them was a profound, unnerving quiet. There was no anger, no shame. There was just a presence, a weight. It was the look of someone waking up from a very, very long sleep. The pianist held the gaze for what felt like an age to the tall man. The chatter of the station seemed to recede. The leader's friends felt their playful mood shift into something uncertain. This wasn't going as planned. Without a word, the pianist turned back to the keyboard. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply let his hands fall back to the keys, but not to the familiar, safe positions of his usual songs. He placed them differently, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly. The permanent slump in his shoulders began to straighten, vertebra by vertebra. He took a deep, audible breath, his chest expanding. He closed his eyes for a single moment, and then he began to play. It was not lively, not in the way the tall man had meant. The first note was a single, deep, resonant chord from the lower end of the piano. It wasn't loud, but it was full asterisk. It vibrated in the air, a sound you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. It was a sound of immense gravity, of storm clouds gathering. Before that note had even finished fading, his left hand began a slow, marching pattern of chords, deep, sorrowful, and powerful. They were the footsteps of a giant. Then his right hand entered, not with a melody, but with a cascading waterfall of notes, clear and ringing, and heartbreakingly beautiful against the dark march below. It was music that belonged in grand concert halls with velvet seats and chandeliers, not in this grimy transit station. It was complex, layered, a story told without words. It swelled with a desperate, aching sadness, then pulled back into passages of fragile, tender hope that made your throat tighten. It was Rachmaninoff, his second piano concerto, one of the most emotionally demanding pieces ever written for the instrument. The change was absolute. The man at the piano was gone. In his place was someone else entirely. His body was no longer slumped but poised, every muscle engaged, his head tilted slightly, listening to the harmonies he was creating. His face, once blank, was now a landscape of feeling, his brows drawn in concentration, his jaw tight with passion, his lips pressed thin with the effort of pulling this immense sound from the old, public piano. The sound itself was a miracle. The slightly out-of-tune piano didn't matter. Under his hands, the imperfections melted away or were woven into the emotion. He wasn't just playing the notes. He was commanding the instrument, making it sing, weep, and thunder. The station's hard surfaces, usually an enemy of music, took the sound and threw it back, magnifying it, turning the atrium into the mouth of a cavernous cathedral. The tall man took an involuntary step back. The color drained from his face. His $5 bill lay forgotten in the case. All the smug confidence, all the easy laughter, was gone, wiped clean. He was just a young man now, standing frozen, listening to a truth he couldn't comprehend. His friends were statues. Their grins had vanished, replaced by looks of stunned disbelief, of dawning, awful shame. One of them simply stared at the pianist's flying fingers, his mouth slightly open around them. The river of the station was freezing solid. People 10 feet away stopped talking. A man dropped his briefcase. A woman slowly pulled out her earbuds. the tinny pop music from them sounding silly and small against this wave of sound. They turned, they stepped closer, they formed the beginnings of a crowd, dozens of faces, all etched with the same shock. They were hearing something impossible. They were witnessing a secret being unveiled, and the sheer, breathtaking beauty of it was a physical force in the air. The pianist played on, lost in the world he was creating. He was no longer the destitute man. He was a vessel for something vast and old and sorrowful. He was playing a story of loss, and everyone hearing it, for the first time, was finally listening. The laughter of minutes ago now felt like a cruel, distant memory, a tiny, insignificant noise swallowed by the majesty of the music. The sound didn't just stop the crowd, it pulled the air from the entire atrium. That first, deep chord was a key turning in a lock no one knew existed. For the man on the bench, the world outside the piano fell away. The flickering lights, the rumble of a distant train, the smell of pretzels and damp wool, it all dissolved into a gray fog. His eyes, which a moment before had held a weary quiet, were now fixed on some invisible point just beyond the music stand. They weren't seeing the chipped wood or the faded advertisements. They were seeing something else entirely, a memory, a feeling, a landscape of sound only he could navigate. His posture was completely transformed. The defeated slump was gone, replaced by a straight-backed intensity. His shoulders were relaxed but powerful, like an athlete's before a race. Every line of his body pointed towards the keyboard, pulled by a magnetic force. He leaned into the instrument, his head moving slightly with the rise and fall of the phrases, as if he were listening to a voice only he could hear, whispering the next note. His hands were a revelation. Before, they had moved with a polite, mechanical efficiency. Now, they were alive. They weren't just hitting keys. They were speaking, arguing, weeping, and soaring. His fingers, those long, slender fingers with their uneven nails, flew across the keyboard with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. They blurred, becoming arcs of motion, dancing one moment and striking with decisive power the next. When a passage required a thunderous, rumbling bass, his whole left arm would come down, his shoulder driving the force, his body weight behind it. For the delicate, heartbreakingly tender high notes, his right hand would lift, his wrist flexible and soft, touching the keys like they were made of thin glass. The music itself was a living thing. It wasn't just a tune. It was a story without words. It began with that sorrowful, marching rhythm in the left hand, a sound of heavy footsteps, of carrying a great weight. It was the sound of grief itself, deep and unshakable. But woven through that darkness, his right hand spun threads of the most painful, beautiful melody. It was a memory of something bright and lost. It would climb, hopeful and clear, reaching for the light, only to be pulled back down by the deep, dragging chords below. It was a fight, a struggle between despair and the fragile, stubborn will to remember joy. He played through the concerto's famous opening, and then, without pausing, he surged into the next section. The public piano, that battered, slightly out-of-tune box of wood and wire, groaned and sang under his command. He knew its every weakness, every dead spot, every key that buzzed. He worked around them, or used them, turning the instrument's flaws into part of the music's raw, aching character. The sound was bigger than the piano had any right to produce. It filled the high, vaulted space of the station, bouncing off the marble and tile, washing over the crowd in warm, complex waves. The young man who had tossed the $5 bill stood rigid. His face, which had been so full of smug confidence, was now pale. His mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. The joke had turned on him, and the weight of his own earlier laughter sat in his stomach like a stone. He wasn't seeing a destitute man anymore. He was seeing an artist, a master of something he himself could never understand. The difference between them wasn't about money or suits. It was about soul, and in that moment, he felt a poverty deeper than any he had ever imagined. He couldn't look away. He could only listen and feel small. His friends were the same. One had taken a half step back, as if physically pushed by the sound. Another had his arms crossed tightly over his chest, not in defiance, but as if holding himself together. The woman who had been with them had tears welling in her eyes, though she didn't know why. The music was bypassing her thoughts and speaking directly to something old and sad inside her. But the change wasn't just in them. It rippled outwards. A college student with a backpack covered in band patches had been rushing for a train. He skidded to a halt, his head whipping around. He was a music major. He knew this piece. He knew how difficult it was, how it broke the fingers and the spirit of even dedicated students. He stood, frozen, his train forgotten, He watched the man's technique, the flawless pedaling, the voicing of the chords where every inner note could be heard. He wasn't just hearing a performance. He was witnessing a miracle on a public piano. A single tear tracked a line through the city grime on his cheek. An elderly couple, dressed in neat, old-fashioned coats, had been slowly making their way to the platform. They stopped. The old man's hand, which had been holding his wife's elbow, tightened its grip. His wife's free hand came up to her chest. They looked at each other, and in that look was a shared lifetime of memories, joy, loss, love, all stirred up by this unexpected flood of sound. They didn't speak. They just turned together, facing the piano, and listened. A janitor, leaning on his wide push broom by a pillar, stopped his work. He rested his chin on his hands, folded over the broom handle. His tired face softened. For him, the station was a place of mess and noise and endless, repetitive work. This sound, this beautiful, complicated sadness didn't belong here. It was a gift. He closed his eyes and just listened. The crowd grew, but it was the quietest crowd the station had ever known. People stepped off the escalators and stopped moving. They came out of the coffee shop, holding their lattes, and drifted towards the sound. They formed a wide, loose circle, 5, then 10 people deep. No one pushed. No one spoke. The only sounds were the magnificent pouring forth of the piano and the distant, ghostly echo of a train announcement. Now just a muffled murmur. Phones came out, but not with the usual quick, dismissive snaps. They were lifted slowly, reverently, to record. Small, glowing screens held aloft, not to capture a joke, but to preserve a moment of unexpected truth. The pianist was unaware of it all. Sweat beaded on his temples, tracing a path through the gray at his hairline. A muscle twitched in his jaw. This was not just playing. It was an excavation. He was digging up something he had buried a long time ago, and it was taking everything out of him. With every crashing chord, he was shedding years of numbness. With every soaring melodic line, he was remembering what it felt like to feel, truly and terribly. The music was a storm, and he was at the very center of it, giving himself over completely. He built the piece to a furious, passionate climax, his hands a whirlwind on the keyboard. The sound so rich and full it seemed the old piano would burst apart. And then, with a master's control, he pulled it back. The storm passed. The music softened, becoming a series of lingering, questioning phrases. The final notes were not a loud bang, but a resolution, a deep, solemn chord that rang out, clear and true, and then was allowed to fade into a humming silence. His hands lifted from the keys and settled gently in his lap. The spell was broken. For a long moment, there was absolute quiet in the atrium. Then, as if waking from a shared dream, the crowd erupted. The silence after the final note was a living thing. It was thick and full, humming with the memory of the sound. It wasn't an empty quiet. It was a quiet of held breath, of stunned minds trying to catch up. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Then, it shattered. It wasn't just applause. It was an explosion of sound from the crowd. A roaring, thunderous wave of clapping, cheering, and whistles that echoed off the marble walls louder than any train. People who had never spoken to each other were smiling, their eyes wide. Someone shouted bravo. The word, foreign and formal in the gritty station, felt exactly right. The man on the bench seemed to return to his body slowly, painfully. The straight-backed maestro dissolved. His shoulders crept up towards his ears again, the familiar slump returning like a heavy coat being put back on. He blinked, looking at his hands in his lap as if he didn't quite recognize them. Then, hesitantly, he turned his head and saw the crowd. There were at least 100 people encircling him now, maybe more. Phones were still held high, little windows capturing his exhausted, bewildered face. The sight seemed to overwhelm him. He looked down quickly, avoiding all the eyes. With movements that were once again slow and careful, he reached out and closed the piano lid. The soft thud was a full stop. He took the cloth from the top of the piano and laid it over the keys, a gentle, final gesture. He did not bow. He did not smile. He simply picked up his old leather bag and the violin case, not even glancing at the money inside, which was now buried under a layer of bills, 20s, 10s, more 5s tossed in during the applause. He stood up, his movements stiff. The crowd's cheers softened into a more persistent, eager chatter. People surged forward, not to mock, but to connect. The young financial worker, his face still pale, stepped forward as if to say something, his mouth opening and closing. But the pianist was already moving, his head down, weaving through the crowd with a quiet, "Excuse me," repeated like a mantra. He didn't run, but he walked with a purpose directly towards the east exit. The one he always used. He pushed through the heavy doors and vanished into the chilly night. Behind him, the station was buzzing like a hive. The crowd didn't disperse. They clustered in small groups, talking animatedly. Did you see his hands? What was that piece? I've got to find it. Who is he? I got the whole thing on my phone. The videos didn't just spread. They went supernova. By midnight, the clip was on every major social media platform. The algorithm, always hungry for real human magic, feasted on it. The captions wrote themselves. Hidden master in the metro. They laughed until he played. The greatest performance you'll never see live. By the next morning, it was national news. A morning talk show played the clip, the hosts gasping dramatically. Online, the digital detectives got to work. It didn't take long. Someone enhanced a clear shot of his face from a video. An older woman, a retired music teacher in a suburb 3 states away, saw it on her tablet over breakfast. She dropped her spoon with a clatter. Oh my heavens, she whispered to her empty kitchen. That's Leo Thorne. She typed the name into a comment section with trembling fingers. That was the key. The name, once entered into the bloodstream of the internet, triggered a flood of memories from a niche world. Links to old articles surfaced. Black and white concert programs, scanned and uploaded. A biography from a long-defunct classical music magazine. Leonard Leo Thorne, a child prodigy from a small town, won his first national competition at 12, played with the city symphony at 16. He was called the next great romantic, a pianist with a thunderous technique but a rare, deep sensitivity. He had a brilliant career ahead of him. And then, a decade ago, he had simply vanished. The articles dried up. There was no scandal, no big announcement. He canceled a European tour citing personal reasons and never rebooked it. The classical music world, focused on the next new thing, moved on. He became a footnote, a whatever happened to story for old patrons. The personal reason, dug up by a determined journalist from the old symphony's personnel files, was a quiet tragedy. His wife, a cellist, had passed away after a short, brutal illness. They had no other family. The grief, those who remembered said, had been absolute. It hadn't just saddened him, it had erased him. The music in him, it seemed, had been tied to her. When she was gone, his reason for playing that way, for playing with that soul, was gone too. The story made everything impossibly more poignant. The frayed suit wasn't just poverty, it was a uniform of mourning. The simple songs weren't a lack of skill. They were the only ones empty enough for him to bear playing. The vacant stare was a man living in a different time. News vans gathered outside the modest, somewhat run-down shelter in a quiet part of the city where a reporter had tracked him. The director, a kindly, overwhelmed woman, confirmed a quiet man matching his description had been staying there off and on for years. Always polite, always keeping to himself. Offers poured in. Emails flooded the shelter's ancient computer. The conductor of the National Symphony, an older man who had once championed the young Leo, gave a tearful televised interview, offering him a guest soloist spot for as long as he wants it. A famous piano manufacturer offered him a brand new concert grand, delivered anywhere. A popular online fundraiser started for him shot past its goal in minutes. The world wanted to give him everything he seemed to have lost. 2 days after the performance, a young, earnest reporter from the city paper managed to find him. The pianist was back at the station, not to play, but simply sitting on a bench near his piano, which was now surrounded by a velvet rope and a sign that read, "Please respect the artist." He was just watching the people, his bag at his feet. The reporter approached slowly, her voice soft. "Mr. Thorne?" Leo, he looked up. He looked even more tired, the attention weighing on him physically. Could I ask you just one question?" He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She knelt down, not getting too close. Why play that piece, after all this time, on that night? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He looked past her, at the piano under its rope. "They asked for something lively," he said, his voice a dry rustle, barely audible over the station noise. "Something with life." He paused, choosing his words with care. "That piece, it has all the life I had left. It's the sorrow, and the memory of the joy. It's everything." He looked at his hands. The music was always there, inside the piano, inside me. People they couldn't hear it until they decided to look. He met her eyes for a second, until they saw the costume wasn't right. "What will you do now?" She asked gently. The whole world wants to help. A faint, sad ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was the first expression anyone had seen on his face besides emptiness or concentration. The world is loud, he said simply. I forgot how loud it is. He stood up, picking up his bag. He didn't head for the exit. Instead, he walked to the roped-off piano. He ignored the sign, unhooked the rope, and sat down. The crowd that had been milling nearby froze, phone snapping up again. He didn't play Rachmaninoff. He played a simple, sweet, old folk song. It was quiet. It was gentle. It was for himself. And this time, the people who listened differently. They heard the man, not the costume. They heard the story in the simple notes. And they finally understood that the most profound performances aren't always about the most difficult music, but about the truth behind it. The world, having found its hidden maestro, did not easily let him go. For a few weeks, the station became a strange kind of pilgrimage site. Tourists mixed with commuters, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the man or hear him play again. The velvet rope stayed around the piano, a flimsy barrier against curiosity. News crews, finding no new drama, eventually packed up and left. The online frenzy, as it always does, slowly churned towards the next miraculous story. But for the man on the bench, nothing was simple. The avalanche of offers, the symphony spot, the new piano, the pile of money from the fundraiser sat in a folder at the shelter, mostly unread. He knew what they wanted. They wanted the spectacle again. They wanted the flash of pain and genius, neatly packaged into a comeback story. They wanted to fix him, to put him back on a stage where he belonged, to complete the narrative. The problem was that narrative had ended 10 years ago. He couldn't go back to that person. That young man, full of fire and future, was gone. The man he was now was made of quieter, more brittle stuff. He did accept help, but in his own way, on his own terms. He met quietly with the director of the city's community music school, a place that taught kids in forgotten neighborhoods. He didn't want a job, he said, but he had an idea. With the conductor from the symphony, who treated him not as a broken thing but as a respected peer, he helped establish a scholarship. It wasn't named after him. They called it the Second Listen Scholarship, for students whose talent might be hidden beneath a difficult life. The money from the fundraiser, a sum that felt enormous and unreal to him, was used to fund it. He liked that. The noisy, digital compassion of the world was being turned into something quiet and concrete. A child, getting an instrument, a year of lessons, a chance. He found a small, clean room in a quiet building not far from the river, paid for with a modest stipend from the scholarship fund. It had a window, a bed, a hot plate, and space for his old bag and the photograph. It was enough. He was, for the first time in a decade, safe. The gnawing fear of where he would sleep or how he would eat was gone. It left a strange silence in its place, a space he didn't yet know how to fill. And he still went to the station. He went at different times, avoiding the evening rush. Sometimes he would just sit on a bench with a cup of tea, watching the patterns of people. Sometimes he would walk up to the piano, unhook the rope, and sit for a while. He didn't always play, and when he did, it was never the grand, devastating concerto. That had been a wartime earthquake, a crack in the dam that could not be reopened daily. He played other things. Sometimes it was that simple folk song. Sometimes it was a fragment of Bach, clean and mathematical, a puzzle for his fingers to solve. Sometimes it was just chords, letting them ring and blend in the space. Listening to the sound of the old piano itself, his playing had changed. The emptiness was gone. It wasn't the fiery, passionate voice of his youth either. It was something new, thoughtful, patient, sometimes sad, sometimes touched with a fragile peace. He was playing for himself again, but now he wasn't afraid if someone else listened. The people who stopped to listen now were different. They didn't see a destitute man. They saw the pianist. But more than that, they began to see the man, a regular, an older woman who worked in the flower shop in the station, started leaving a fresh cup of tea for him on the ledge of the piano when she saw him arrive. She never said a word about it. The janitor would give him a small nod, a silent communication between two people who understood the rhythms of the place. One afternoon, a young mother with a toddler in a stroller paused. The child, a little boy with wide eyes, was fussing. The man was playing a gentle, rolling lullaby, something half remembered from his own childhood. The boy stopped crying and listened, his thumb in his mouth. The mother mouthed thank you over the stroller. The man gave a small, genuine smile and a nod. It was a human moment, tiny and perfect. It was not a donation. It was a connection. The young financial worker from that Tuesday night came back. He came alone, after work, still in his suit but without the loud friends. He stood at the edge of the space for a long time, watching as the pianist worked through a slow, melancholic piece. When the man finished, the young worker approached. He looked nervous. I owe you an apology, he said, the words coming out in a rush. For that night. It was I was. The pianist looked up at him. He saw not a bully, but a young man etched with the sharp, early lines of his shame he would carry for a long time. You asked for something lively, the pianist said, his voice calm. You got a lesson instead. Sometimes they're the same thing. The young man didn't seem to know what to say to that. He just nodded, swallowed hard, and walked away. The pianist watched him go. He felt no triumph, only a faint pity. The boy had been given a gift, to the uncomfortable gift of seeing himself clearly. Not everyone got that. As the months turned, a new routine settled. He would teach, once a week, at the community school. He didn't teach prodigies. He taught a shy girl who was terrified of mistakes, and a restless boy who couldn't read music but could play anything he heard once. He taught them to listen, to feel the weight of a key under their finger, to understand that music was a language for things words couldn't say. He was surprisingly good at it. In their struggles, he saw echoes of his own, and in guiding them, he found a path forward for himself. He still had bad days, days where the grief felt fresh, where the quiet of his room was too loud, and the memory of his wife was a physical ache. On those days, he might go to the station and not play at all, or he might play the saddest things he knew, letting the pain flow out through his fingertips instead of staying stuck inside. And people would still listen. They would hear the sadness and respect it, not as a performance, but as a man honestly sharing his weather. One evening, as a soft autumn rain painted the station's skylights gray, he sat at the piano. The usual crowd of regulars was there: the flower shop woman, the janitor leaning on his broom, a few students, an elderly couple holding hands. He began to play. It wasn't a famous piece. It was something of his own, a melody that had been forming in him, piece by piece, over the weeks. It was not grand or tragic. It was a walking melody, thoughtful and a little wistful, with a hint of a major key breaking through like sun after rain. It was the sound of someone remembering how to be, if not happy, then at least present. He played it through, and as the last note faded, he looked out at the small, familiar faces. They were smiling, not with the explosive joy of that first night, but with a warm, quiet understanding. The flower shop woman dabbed at her eye with a tissue. The janitor gave his solemn nod. He closed the piano lid. He hooked the rope back, not to keep people away, but to signal he was done. As he picked up his bag, a little girl, maybe 7 years old, broke away from her mother and ran up to him. She held out a drawing on a piece of notebook paper. It was a stick figure at a big piano, with bright yellow sound waves coming out of it, and a big, red heart in the corner. "This is for you," she said, then immediately hid behind her mother's legs. The man took the drawing. He looked at it for a long moment, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "It's very beautiful." He walked towards the east exit, the drawing held carefully in his hand. He pushed through the doors into the cool, rainy evening. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement. He was not a destitute pianist. He was not a vanished prodigy. He was not a viral sensation. He was a man with a small room, a few students, a melody of his own, and a drawing with a red heart. He was a man who had been seen, finally, for what he was, not what he wore or where he sat. And in being seen, he had begun, slowly and painfully, to find his way back to the world. The music had never stopped. It had just been waiting for the right kind of quiet to be heard.